And so again, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Our session today is on hop contracting. And we are, our speakers today, our presenters are Brian Pierce and Steve Loneman from Yakima Chief. So I'm going to pass it over to you guys and take it away.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Nicole. Well, Steve, while I get the presentation up here, I'll let you kick us off.
Yeah, Brian, that sounds good. Thank you. I'll talk to you here soon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Unfortunately, I am not in Yakima today for this presentation, but I very much miss Yakima at this time of the year. So, yeah. Again, my name is Steve Loneman, and I joined Yakima Chief in 2015. Actually, 1 year prior to that, made a visit out to Yakima. Love with the hops out there, and met some really cool individuals working for the company. And next thing you know, a year later, I'm part of the company. I'm part of the team at Yakima Chief Hops. My role today at Yakima Chief Hops is Western Division Lead, along with working on projects with our business and development side, on the contracting side, working with our customers. So yeah, looking forward to a great presentation. And, Brian, I'm gonna hand it off to you.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Steve. And yeah, I'm Brian Pierce, as Nicole said and Steve said. I'm our Vice President of North American Sales. This is now my 5th harvest, 4 years with YCH. And I'm actually, Steve's not here today, but I am, even though the background wall colors look pretty similar. I'm actually in our old Hop Union building today. So I am here in Yakima, and I think like Steve said, we're definitely missing everyone being here in person this year. But excited that we can do some of this kind of stuff. And so I think with the topic today, hop contracting, I'm personally really excited about talking about this today, just because I think this is probably one of the best times ever to talk about it. It's not only just during harvest, but also, you know, we've obviously as an industry gone through a really unique year. So I think it's very relevant and timely for us to revisit this topic and talk through. I think we have some thoughts here today to share about some of the history of it, some perspective, I think, from the hop supply side of things, and also some recommendations on, you know, how to contract moving forward from here this year and into the future. So I guess I want to kick us off first by, you know, just from Yakima Chief Hops to talk a little bit about our mission, vision, and values. You know, our goal, our mission has always been to connect family hop farms with the world's finest brewers. And I think we'll tie that in a lot today as we talk about contracting and that being a really important piece of that connection. It's not just knowing individuals and seeing them in person, or knowing who grows your hops maybe, or where hops end up and who in the brewery is using hops from a grower side, but actually all the other pieces of the overall picture of our supply chain. And those connections. We are you know, our vision is to be the global supplier of choice, and we're focused on sustainability produced, innovative hop products. We want to be a responsible neighbor and asset to our communities, and enriching the products, businesses, and lives of everyone we encounter. And then really our values, you know, we always, what we call our pride statement is passion, respect, integrity, dedication, and excellence. And I think when I think of hop contracting, I think so many of these things kind of jump out to me of you know, it's being really, it's not just how many hops do you need, how many pounds, how many dollars, it's people, right? It's growers here, family farms in the Pacific Northwest, it's brewers out there, you know, using these hops. And also transparency and accountability. When I think of integrity, you know, for us, making that connection means that there is a true connection, and that we're not in the middle of that, but we're here to enhance that, right? And so I think that's something we'll talk a lot about when we tie in contracting. And then you'll probably see us talk a lot about the quality and sustainability aspects of contracting as well. So a little more about us, if you're not familiar. We are a 100% grower-owned hop company. And our grower families have been harvesting hops here since the 1800s. And because of that, we have a lot of wealth and knowledge in doing this really well. And so you can see up on the screen here, these are actually the 14 family farms. There's actually 15 owners, but one of the farms represents 2, so that's why there's 14 on the screen. But family grower-owned farms, many of them being 3rd, 4th, 5th generation even. So when we talk about that wealth of knowledge and experience, it's been passed on for a long time. But this isn't the whole picture. You know, we're 100% grower-owned, but like you can see there, we actually receive hops from over 50 different family farms throughout the Pacific Northwest. So You know, what our position is really in the industry is, you know, we're here to represent farms. We work for farms. And so, you know, those 50 families are who we represent. It's not just our grower ownership. And we'll talk more about that, I think, as we get into it.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Brian, for kicking us off there. And as Nicole mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we're going to talk about hop contract. You know, prior to the current structure that we live in with contracting, the hops really existed in a commodity market where there was a lot of unknowns that were going on within the industry. So, you know, it was a very volatile market. You know, you had, you know, that boom bust cycle that was going on. There was a lot of strain on the brewers and the growers. They had fewer varieties. And we'll see, down the road in the presentation, not a lot of varieties to pick and choose from. Less need for predictability. Not much on the innovation side of it, and then we go to alpha versus aroma. You know, as mentioned, it was a commodity market. You had GR hops, German hops versus our U.S. hops here, and a lot of the focus is now it was not quality focus, and then, you know, just a little bit on the alpha and aroma. You know, back in the days, alpha was dominated by the macro breweries, and a lot of those hops came from Germany. And then now with the aroma, you know, we have another piece of that the hop segment that fits in nicely with our growers here in the U.S. and international. So yeah, that's we're gonna continue talking more on the hop contracting.
Yeah, I think you know, some things that jump out to me, Steve, that you're mentioning too, is that you know, as we talk through kind of some of the history here and also kind of bring it right into 2020 here in a second, but I think that change in alpha versus aroma has been a big shift over the years, and that's something that I think is really important to kind of set the stage for all of this. Is that, yeah, years ago, alpha is what drove the hop industry, right, and drove macro, like you said, and really that Germany and U.S. sort of I guess dichotomy is that Germany had most of the aroma varieties, and the U.S. was known for being like the alpha supply. And I think all of us here, you know, that are on here, maybe if you're not just familiar with today, is that switch has happened significantly, right? Where now the U.S. hop industry is really known for its aroma and flavor hops and what that contribution looks like to craft beer globally. And Germany obviously has a lot of that as well, but also has a huge core of the alpha market still. So that's something that's changed quite a bit over time. So I think to kind of fast forward a big step here into this year, a little bit, get this slide going here. There we go. Is, you know, we'll kind of revisit the timeline here in a second, kind of from the beginning to the end of craft beer and its relationship with contracting. But I think some really important things to take away this year, and I think why we really want to spend some time talking about this as we go through this, is that what does contracting mean this year in 2020? I know that's probably something that's on a lot of brewers' minds with just, you know, going through a lot of the challenges this year with COVID and having, you know, breweries having to be closed for long periods of time. Some still are, or opening and reclosing, and trying to figure out what does that mean when it comes to the hops I need and securing access to hops I need. And so I think some things to bring just from the Valley being here today is that, you know, harvest overall is going well. And I think that should be widely known across the globe, is that I've definitely seen on social media and other places lots of stories around wind and fires and concerns about hops this year. And yes, we've definitely experienced a lot of challenges, but I think a lot of those challenges are very unique to hop growers and everyone here in the Pacific Northwest. But I don't see that really being a major concern for hop contracting and securing contracts for the brewing industry. So from a supply to the brewing industry, we're not seeing a lot of concern as Yakima Chief Hops. We did have a very significant windstorm here beginning of last week that definitely did some damage to fields. There are a lot of fires burning here in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in Oregon, but also in Washington, that are having some major effects. If you could see out the window to my right here, it's just like this gray smoke. It's really hard to see, and so I anticipate that probably hanging out for the rest of the week. But But from a, as a brewer, wherever you are watching this, or even home brewer or anyone, it's not going to necessarily translate to major concerns around varieties being available this year in any way. So like I said, most of that burden really ends up falling on the grower side of things and supplier side of things. So, and then really just as a whole, yields on average are pretty normal. Some varieties are up and down, but once again, we don't see any major concerns. But I do think one thing that's very standout is this year's quality is looking great across the board. So despite a lot of these challenges in timing and farms dealing with a lot of these challenges of just the environment and Mother Nature this year, overall the quality is looking great. I mean, I'm smelling hops every day here as they come in, and the amount of quality and consistency within varieties is pretty outstanding. So I think this year is looking to shape up to be a really nice year from that perspective. And then I think another really important thing, and kind of how this ties to contracting as a whole, is that many people may be aware, but overall hop acreage is up this year in the Pacific Northwest. And I think what's really important to know with this is that acreage through YCH overall is actually down about 10%. So despite the entire industry having and expanding more acres, YCH has not actually been a big part of that at all. We're actually bringing in less hops than we did last year. And really for us, and where this immediately ties back to that balance of contracting, is we're trying to maintain balance as much as we can always between growers and between the beer industry. And part of that connection is making sure we're being responsible. And too many hops means there's a lot of pressures on breweries, and it means there's a lot of pressure on growers, right? And not enough hops is the same problem, just kind of the other way around. So we were very fortunate this year with the timing of the impacts here in the U.S. of having to shelter in place at the end of February, early March, that actually lined up right as farms were out starting to put in new fields, swap out acreage. So as that work was happening, we were able to very quickly adjust for, at the time, what we had modeled out, what we anticipated may happen. And I think, as we can all attest to, we're still learning what might happen next. But I think that's something that I really want to tie into our discussion today with contracting, is that YCH has taken a tremendous leap forward in predicting where things might go, and contracts have been a big part of navigating that, right? Of understanding what demands exist out there, who's looking for what varieties, and that helped us make this decision. And that's why this year I'm very proud to say as a company that we made that decision, because what that's allowed for us in the world of contracts is a lot more flexibility in trying to maintain this balance. So that we're not just adding more and more hops in a year that maybe brewers are really struggling to work through a lot of their contracts. So, and then I think some other things that are important note that tie back to contracting is acreage trends in general. And so if you're maybe not familiar and you're watching this, every year there's actually a national acreage report that's put out at the end of June. If you type in hop acreage report in Google, you'll find it. And it actually shows acreage change year over year by variety. And some things that are really important to note is that varieties like Cascade and Centennial and Chinook are actually seen some really significant acreage decreases year over year. And so, those varieties are ones we often think of as being really ubiquitous and very easy to find in the industry. But what we're seeing is YCH is that a lot of brewers have moved away from contracting some of these varieties because they're so easy to find, right, on the secondhand market, or you maybe have contracted them through someone else. But all that lack of contracting for some of these varieties has actually sent signals to us and to the industry that there's less need for these things. And so, for Cascade and Centennial, we're looking at up to the high 20% decrease in acreage that happened this year. Even Centennial actually being up above 30% decrease in acreage. So, when you look at that, that's not a necessarily concerning thing, but I think it's something everyone should be aware of when you're thinking of contracting, is that there's a lot of shifting going on in the Pacific Northwest. Of what our contracts are telling us people are really looking for. So I think just to kind of to jump back now through some just more history, if you look at the timeline here on the screen, is that we look at the 1980s as sort of being that emergence of craft beer, especially here in North America. And like Steve mentioned earlier, at the time, hops were primarily driven by macro beer. It was very much a commodity market. And because of that, a lot of supply at the time was in a buy-sell model, right? So it was hop suppliers or hop merchants buying hops from growers and saying, here's the value of what they are, and then going to the beer industry and saying, here's how much they're worth, right? And basically within that separation, that model, growers were experiencing, getting paid just enough to make it by, some years taking a loss. And meanwhile, brewers were experiencing prices that were maybe out of line of what growers were being paid. And so that sort of time is what really formed Yakima Chief, and it's why growers came together and said, let's start a company to create a little more transparency in the industry, to make sure that if brewers are paying X for hops, that money is coming back to farms, and also that brewers aren't paying too much for hops based on what the growers are being paid. And so that's where you see the formation of Yakima Chief back in 1988, Yakima Chief Hops. And then you see that explosive growth into the 90s and 2000s, where consumers really latched onto craft beer as something exciting, and were a lot of flavors of beer changed to be very hop forward. And so this is where you see that hop demand starts really outstripping the supply. And part of that is because the industry here in the Pacific Northwest at the time was, like Steve mentioned earlier, very driven by alpha. And so now people are starting to use hops much more for aroma, and latching on to U.S. grown hops for aroma. And because 80% of hops during this period were actually not sold on contract, they were sold on spot, it was very uncertain to what people were going to want and what was driving the market, because most of it was not accounted for on a contract or a commitment of some kind. And so that's where you see things that, which sound maybe surprising today if you didn't live through those times, but that's back when Centennial Type became a blend that was created actually by Hop Union. It was because Centennial was so hard to find, and it was driving a lot of flavors at the time, that they needed to blend hops together to try to recreate that profile so people could use it, because they were seeing a lot of growth at the brewery and were actually being held back by a lack of Centennial to keep that going. So which it's interesting now, I think of Centennial and just everyone's experience with it in recent times, and it would seem like, why would you need to do that? But different times. And then there was a lot less varieties to choose from as well. So, when you think of the amount of varieties that brewers are using today, the amount of varieties being grown, even just on a global scale, not even just the US, predicting how much of those needed to exist in the world, and working with growers on those planting recommendations. We're actually still out of balance at that time, but there was only 10, 15 varieties here in the US we're really worried about, and that has just increased tremendously. So, and then you kind of get to this line of demarcation here on the screen of that 2007, 2008, or what's sort of unofficially coined as the hop crisis. And I think anyone that lived through that would probably agree that was the right name at the time. But really what this is, if you're not familiar, is a culmination of a really poor harvest year, and this continuation of demand outstripping supply. And then within that year itself, there was actually a really significant warehouse fire, actually not that far away from where I am, here with the hop supplier. And that actually eliminated another million plus pounds of hops out of the industry. So in a year where yields were low and it was already hard to get things, all of a sudden you just lost them like that, just overnight. So that's what was kind of coined, like I said, the term the hop crisis. And this is where you see a big shift in the industry to contracting, right? I think at this time it was, okay, we're tired of not having access to what we need as brewers. And, especially in this year, I mean, what it turned into is a lot of breweries having to change flagship recipes and things just to be able to use the hops they could access, right? And so that's where you see this, after this period is when about 80% plus hops, the hops sold become hops sold on contract. And the spot market is actually now a much smaller portion. But because of that, it's had a lot of positive influences on the industry. So that's where you see that's why in recent times, since the early 2000s and on, you see this continued drive of interest in craft beer, but also this continued drive of exploring new flavors and new aromas and hops, and what's the next best thing that could impart flavor and aroma in my beer. And so, but because of that, we also saw in 2015, 2016 time period, what I think the brewing industry would say was a hop surplus, right? And I think I'll say from a Yakima Chief Hops perspective, we never felt like there was too many hops, or we never saw that in our inventories. We were actually starting to experience in these years some record low carryover in inventory year over year. But nonetheless, I think there was some overcorrection, right, from the 2007, 2008, where the hop contract at the time was, let's contract 5 or more years out. Let's actually increase my contract year over year because we're growing. So I'm going to anticipate I need more and more every year. And so that sort of contracting behavior and path is what got us to this place where suddenly a lot of brewers found themselves contracted with multiple suppliers and maybe doubled up or tripled up on certain varieties. Maybe, some of it maybe just because of trying to plan on not getting delivered on that, because the recent experience has been the hop crisis. And so you tend to over contract, hoping that you'll at least get what you need. But then also, just certain varieties, have also come in the picture at the time. And so you see that sort of model happening until about this time period. And that's really what's kind of led us to a lot of what we're going to talk through today, is that, maybe the 5-year contract and maybe this projection up like that, planning for growth, is actually not the best model. And there's a lot of reasons why. And so that's where today, like we're talking today and into the future, balance is much more of the model we want to achieve. And there, we definitely have some recommendations on how to best go about doing that. But it's setting yourself up for sustainable contracts, understanding the value of the entire supply chain and the effect of contracting. And it's not just a sale of hops and committing to working with a supplier, but it's actually connecting with growers in the whole supply chain and sending those signals throughout the industry that this is what I'm needing, or this is what the brewery here thinks we need. And then also, it's something to just kind of keep in mind is, as this timeline goes on, you see that there's a huge array of varieties. So like I kind of just mentioned, there's more varieties in the picture. Going back a long ways, you only had a few aroma varieties. Well, now there's so many. So there's more breweries, there's so many more varieties. And so suddenly what we need to try to balance also is much more complex than it was a long time ago. So I think another way of looking at this is actually a slide from the Brewers Association that was presented back in 2019 that shows the growth of number of craft breweries over this last sort of century. And you can see here, if we line this up with our timeline that we're just looking at, is that, you have in the 80s this emergence of craft beers. So you start seeing more and more breweries pop up after almost, kind of the whole 20th century being pretty low in the count of breweries since Prohibition. Then you see that explosive growth in the 90s, where all of a sudden there's a huge increase of interest in breweries and new breweries opening. And then you see here this sort of slowing or actually dip in the graph is right around the same time as the hop crisis, right? It's that 2006, 2008. And obviously there's a lot of other things going on, especially in the US at this time, right? You have the beginning of a recession, and kind of we're post some large events going on in the early 2000s. So you see this slowdown, but it's interesting that the hop crisis also lines up with this, and is a big part of actually the slowing is not only the market itself in the US slowing, but also the industry having a really hard time supplying the hops that were needed for breweries. Then you see the hop surplus, like I mentioned, and actually what's interesting to this, and I think what kind of paints that picture from a hop supplier perspective, is that that thought at the time that there was so many extra hops in the world, you don't see that slowing down growth of number of breweries and entry of breweries in the market and the growth of the craft industry as a whole. I think what we see is that affecting some breweries more than others. But anyways, you see that sort of, that hasn't, stopped things necessarily like the hop crisis had in here. And then where we are today and where we're hoping to move into always is that balance, right? So you see that now there's record number of breweries and sort of the amount of balance that we need to achieve, so. Steve, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Wow, Brian, there's a lot of good information you just shared there. It's exciting to see, just today that, where we were at years back and where we're at today. Still a lot of excitement from, all of the hop suppliers, all of our family farms, all of the breweries that are out there, and then the consumer. They still are challenging us today on with their palate. They're always looking for something new. And, we're all working together to provide that. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, so this slide here, we're just going to talk a little bit about the birth of craft beer. And as we've mentioned a couple times, if you look to the right, my right, that is, the table of contents, that's from an old Hop Union hop book from June of 1995. That's way back. And as you can see, we were talking a little bit ago about the aroma hops. A lot of those are German hops right there. You got a couple that are US, and then there's some dual purpose hops on that bottom list there. So a lot of changes from 1995 to where we're at today in 2020 and soon to be 2021. So yeah, and then here comes craft beer. That's when the farms started realizing that, there's opportunities, potential, for a more diverse number of varieties. But with that, as you continue to grow, there's always going to be the pros and the cons. A couple call outs. I mean, you're on the pro side, higher price per acre. Farms are really dialed in on the quality aspect of hops. And then you start shifting into, finding a larger customer base that you want to secure to, reach out with your hops. Some cons aroma hops, unfortunately, you're challenged. Sometimes you'll get less yield, on the bales per acre. More diversity. With that comes some difficult times on predicting the hops and the picking windows. It's an ongoing thing from the very beginning of the spring season until that harvest window. And then acreage shifts are very expensive. When you're adjusting to new acreage or just expanding on a certain hop. So a lot really goes into the craft beer there. So next. And then here, we nice segue into the contracts. So this is a great slide to talk about the contracts. To the right again is an old hop union contract from looks like 2011. So yeah, we were getting contracts back then. Yeah, so it's hops are expensive. Versus a typical or a non-hop agriculture product, and you're looking at roughly about 14,000-ish an acre. And growers are always looking, and they need that assurance on the investments, and that's really when the contracting kicked in. A lot of that was driven from that aroma market. And again, we started that shift from the alpha into the aroma market. Giving growers that confidence to install new acreage, reinvest in acreage, in new varieties, new equipment, and then on top of all that, some continuing excitement around the breeding program. A lot of good stuff started happening with the breeding program because of the reinvestment. We're able to really dial into what we are hearing from the brewers, what you want for your finished goods for your customers. And it just gave us another, more balance where we can have alpha hops and we can also focus on the aroma side.
Yeah, definitely. I think what really jumps up to me, Steve, at, kind of what you're talking about here and seeing the contract back then as contracting started evolving kind of in that time period, then, post the hop crisis, so to say, is that aroma started driving things a lot more in sort of like the decommodification of hops, right? And so that's also the value of the contract look too, is not only did it help that to happen, but it also makes sure that there's stability in that. And so that's, like you said, getting tied into, okay, well, now we know there's future investments happening. Brewers are interested in these hops, and that allows growers and and organizations like Yakima Chief Ranches and Hop Breeding Company to start working towards breeding new flavors and aromas that the industry is starting to really move into. But
yeah, definitely. Yeah, so this slide here is a real nice slide provided by the Brewers Association. Just really out the number of varieties. We were talking about diversity. Look at 2008. There's only 90 varieties out there. And then we move all the way to 2018. Those are a couple bumps right there, but there's over 154 varieties. A lot of aroma hops. Next slide, Brian.
yeah, sorry, get some background noise here. Yeah, so I guess with all that being said, and kind of the history is why bother contracting? Well, I think a really important place to start is this is also some information from the Brewers Association back in 2019, and they had a really great presentation actually at CBC for anyone that might have attended that, just talking about the value of contracting, kind of what they're seeing. But obviously, it'll be very interesting to see after this year some of those impacts. This is definitely looking at just the trends kind of pre-COVID, but you see overall this large reduction in contracting happening, and part of I think part of the goal of having this discussion today is to paint some light or shed some light, paint a picture from a hop supplier side of what that might mean. But you see that back at the end of 2018 and in that 2019 brewing cycle, that 80-ish% that things had been at and actually higher has started to decline, right? And some of that, I think, there's a lot you could talk about. Some of it is a lot more small breweries entering the market who maybe don't know where to start with contracting yet, or they don't need it maybe because they're able to, their barrelage is low enough, they're able to find stuff through spot or through neighboring breweries, right, or online through secondhand. And then, but you do see that overall breweries were trending downwards in contracting behavior. And so I think, when I look at why and some of the things that we're talking about now is, if we look at that number of 63% of all US breweries contracting and right, before 2020, having a little over 7,000 breweries, you can see there it's about, 2,698 breweries not contracting. So what this means, from a YCH, when we're looking at this, is that we have a record number of breweries we're working with. We have a record number of varieties in the market, like Steve just pointed out, the amount of varieties in use today. But we have the least amount of insight into what those needs are since 2008, right? So we have way more complexity and more people involved than ever, but we don't necessarily have as clear of a picture as we maybe had over the last several years in where people are planning on going with their needs. And so I don't think that's something necessarily to say is like, oh, this is a big alarmist sort of a statement at all, but I think it's a reality of what we're seeing. And I think everything we've all gone through over this year with COVID and sort of the challenges that's presented the beer industry and the hop industry is that I think it drives home even more importance that there's a ton of value here in contracting, and that, even though there's a lot more unknown this year than I think, than we've had kind of pre-COVID, there's also a ton of value in saying, here's what I think I'm going to need. Here's some of the, at least baseline, here's some I know I'm going to do. Even if that picture is not as clear for brewers, helping the hop industry and sending those signals of here's what I need allows us to try to maintain that balance as much as possible. And I think if we see that further movement away from contracting continue, it will probably result in challenges in making sure that we are growing enough of certain varieties that people are seeking, or that we're moving away from varieties, like I mentioned earlier, like Cascade, Centennial, and Chinook, that people are still needing, but maybe just not sending the signals to the hop industry that, yes, I would still like acreage every year of some of those varieties. So I think, with that, some other sort of effects you see, right, Steve, is sort of just what this happen or how this plays out then too, when things aren't on contract in the secondhand market. So.
Yeah, Brian, you nailed it when you said value. I mean, that value hits all of us. I mean, it hits the brewery, it hits the growers, it hits everyone. It's a powerful word, and the feedback that's we receive back from surveys, from harvest, from all that, anything that we can do to all of us to continue to have the right acreage, the right hop, to take care of your contracting needs. And leads right into segue into this next slide. Why contract? Stability. Stability for the brewers. We want to have a fair price out there to our customers. And not just take care of one customer, take care of all of our customers with their hop needs. And again, that's where that contracting really plays a important role with making sure that we've got the right acreage, we've got the right hops, and we can take care of your brewing needs. Yeah, another slide on why contract. The hop market is challenging, and we need to be mindful that working with an agriculture product, harvest, it only comes once a year. That's it. We get one chance, one shot. That's it. And with that, there comes a level of unpredictability. We can't control what happens with the weather. Brian's about that. And then yield. We get a gauge on how the yield's going to look, but we really don't know until harvest is actually over to see what the yield looks like. And that weather definitely does have an effect on crop. But it's nice to hear Brian mention earlier that it sounds like we've got a nice quality crop coming in this year. And then storage sometimes can be poor storing. And then there's a high cost of production, and there's barriers that come with the production. Next slide.
Yeah. I think just real quick, Steve, too, touching on that, that's some of those factors with hops is despite our high quality packaging and production, right, it's still that hops will degrade over time, right? That's just a fact. And so that's part of that, balance the hop industry is always playing is we can't just plan on overproducing and then sit on something for a long time and we'll work through it and I think brewers know this, obviously more than anyone is like that crop year cycle and when do I want to use new crops and things like that. And so we only have that one shot a year. It's a lot of it's in Mother Nature's hands, right? And how things are going to turn out. And whatever we do get is really, it has a very short lifespan. So it's something that those signals, like we talked about sending through with contracts and having suppliers understand what those needs are really, really valuable to ensure that we're getting it right and trying to maintain as much balance as possible.
Yeah. And we realize that, there's a lot of moving parts to that. Right now we're looking at, we've got the 2019 crop that needs to get out so we can, get ready for the incoming crop with 2020. So there's a lot of moving parts on, all ends, with us making sure that, we just have the right balance. I think we're down a couple slides, Brian. Oh, yeah.
There you go. So yeah, I think just like we kind of saw there, it's not just about stability, like we keep saying, but it's about sustainability too, knowing that we really want to carry that over year after year and into the future. It's not just about now, right, this year, it's also about making sure that we're ahead of those needs for years to come. So part of that balance is also getting ahead and planning ahead, right? It's not just getting it right once a year, every year, but trying to adjust over time. And I think that ties into this really nicely and some of the things you mentioned earlier, Steve, about like acreage and some of the financial investment and cost and the high cost it is for growers to make changes is, we look at this a lot as sort of a ongoing cycle. And so, starting with the brewer, right, is bringing that forecast and feedback to us around what your needs are, what you like, what you don't like. Are there certain aspects of hops that maybe, you don't like the dank characters you might get in something or whatever. Any of that feedback is valuable, along with quotes and contracts, so that together we can take that information and plan and procure with growers, right? So we work very closely, especially with Yakima Chief Ranches, right, in securing acreage and making sure we have the right spread of varieties at different farms. To make sure we hit, if there's quality concerns or thoughts around different flavors and varieties, then we want that feedback just as much as a contract, because that informs us too. Are certain farms hitting the right pick windows, or if they are, do we need to adjust pick windows to maybe keep up with some of the needs of the industry at the time? And contracting and having discussions is a huge driver in us being successful at that. And then really from there, it's growers planting and growing their hops, managed, a lot with the Green Chief program to help maintain quality standards and work with growers on best practices, not necessarily just from Yakima Chief, but from other growers and what works really well. And then you get into production and packaging and storage. So now we're making all of this, right, for the contracts that we know are in place, as well as what we think there might be for a spot market. And then back to the brewery, right? And that just keeps going. And I think when we talk about balance, in my mind, it's this circle, it's wheel turning and balancing that all the time, right? And keeping it spinning. So I think another, just why should I care, is actually, we'll jump in here as a quote from Jason Peralt, is he said, for us, this is about generations down the road, not years. So like I talked about that sustainable aspect, and we've literally bet the farm on our relationships with brewers with sustainable long-term debt incurred to reinvest. But the sustainability that YCH, YCR, and breweries bring gives us the confidence to make that bet, right? And so a big part of that is this contracts. As Jason, being part of the Peralt family, one of the founding members of our organization, stating that growers are looking into the future. They're looking generations and wanting sustainability, and with that comes contracting to ensure that's there, right? So you have those 3-year looks and that continuation of business, and knowing that business is there is what allows growers to make those investments. And so, those sustainable grower returns equal reinvestments in quality for brewers. Contracts allow for that long-term farm investment. So, facilities like the one pictured here is a new kiln facility that actually went in last year, before last harvest at Peralt Farms. And, we're looking at something that has significant financial investment. And so knowing that there's contracts that are going to support the use of this facility and that it'll pay for itself to exist, is a big part of pushing that quality of hops back out to the brewing industry. And that's also, like we mentioned already, but just that equals, that's funds then that go to the breeding program for continued viability. And so breeding adds value to the overall supply chain, not only just through unique flavors and aromas for brewers using them in beers, for the agronomic improvements we're talking about, but also for that brewer-grower feedback. And really agronomic improvement, you can also look at the quality and reinvesting in new facilities, but every farm is also challenged by having limitations to throughput and how much they can grow and how much they can kiln in the right pick windows. And so that is also an investment in quality when it comes to trying to breed new varieties that may hit better pick windows. I think, we all know it's no secret Citra and Mosaic are in high demand, right? And for a lot of farms, that's a very crowded pick window. They actually share a pick window. It's that the early to middle late sort of month time in September. We're getting a lot of Citra and Mosaic in now. It's a very crowded pick window. You'd often hear a lot of growers say. And so, putting funding into breeding programs through contracting and things like that is actually what allows, we just had the launch here end of August of Talus, right? A new variety. It has a little bit of an adjusted pick window. So it works really well for growers, but it does something really interesting for brewers as well. I think even 2 years ago when Sabra was named as a new variety, right? It actually has an incredibly early pick window, which is very uncommon in a space that's mostly occupied right now by Centennial, Cascade, and Simcoe. So there's some room in there. So now you have this really unique flavor, something new for brewers, but it's actually really beneficial for growers too. It's very pest resistant, yields well. And so all of that is a continuation of innovation and quality that really comes through the consistency and sustainability we see through contracting. And then something I think that's really unique to Yakima Chief Hops and being a grower company and something we talk about on a regular basis here is what we call our return to grower, or what we often just refer to as RTG internally. But really what's important to know for brewers is that for every $1 per kg or $1 per pound of hops sold, 78% of all of that sales revenue goes back to growers. And this includes both grower owners and our allied growers, right? So it's not just the 14, 15 people we talked about that were on the screen. It's all the growers we work with, and they all benefit in the same way, right? So there's not necessarily an advantage for a grower owner over an allied grower when it comes to getting a return on their hops, right? So, another way to think of that is for every $1 that we bring in, 78 cents of that goes back to a grower, right? And so that's the part of the value we often talk about in hop contracting is that what you're letting Yakima Chief know and other suppliers, but Yakima Chief in this model is that I want these hops, I'm going to need these, I'm going to use these, and we're going to buy them. And that means that from a grower perspective, I can see this, know what my return is going to be, and say, okay, like there's a future here for us to put in new facilities to expand acreage. And so what you see is those strong sustainable returns allow growers to make those investments. And just as an example, over the last 6 years, with all the growers we work with directly, you see that there's 33 new picking machines and 22 new kilns, 24 new baling rooms, and also that sustainable fair wage for laborers and for farm workers here in the Pacific Northwest, so that they have a good paycheck, a living wage, some consistency and sustainability in their jobs as well. So for brewers, it's, when we think about contracting, it's, what you're participating is superior hop quality, right? Which ultimately just turns into being great beer. So I think that's a lot of just sort of the history and sort of how we look at it as Yakima Chief, and also directly, thinking about return to grower, what that means for growers and family farms. But Steve, I guess then the big question I would have in my mind, right, is how do you go about actually contracting?
Yeah, well, a lot of good stuff leading up to that. Yeah. I think the most important thing here is keeping that word sustainability close in mind when you're working on a contract. Is we all want sustainability. We're looking for that. What we recommend at Yakima Chief Hops is that 3-year rolling cycle of a contract. Let's try and put it in play where it's a sustainable contract. An example here on the side chart there is, crop year 2020. Look at getting as close as you can to, 100% of your needs for your upcoming brew year. And then when you go into that 2021 crop year, let's shoot for that 70-75%, mark. And then that third year, 50-55%. It's give or take on those numbers, but again, that's what we recommend. And, you know, we've been seeing a lot of, you know, success working with our customers. You know, so besides that 3-year look and, you know, looking to make sure we have a sustainable contract, it also allows time to where you can revisit those contracts and we can make adjustments as needed. You know, we all know that the consumer is constantly changing. So, you know, we are mindful of that, and we try to work with our customers to allow those adjustments on the contracts. And, you know, it just really does, it provides a nice balance and of that risk and the responsibility and the planning for your brewery. And it really helps the farms. And it's that perfect balance. And, you know, one other important note here is stay in contact with your supplier. You know, have those regular conversations, which, you know, I guess we can talk right into this next slide, is have those regular conversations and follow that harvest cycle. So, you know, we're not going to put a date out there or anything like that. Just follow the harvest. You know, growers are planting the acreage in the winter, the late winter. So reach out to your hop supplier and start reviewing your contracts. Everybody, you know, should have a pretty good idea in the fall what's going on with the upcoming spring and whatnot. And then, you know, that should help you be very much dialed in for the upcoming harvest. If you're looking to reach out and work on the contracts in the summer, that might be a little bit too late. I'm not saying it's going to be late, but I mean, you are pushing the windows because the hops are getting planted in the spring. Planting those hops based off of those sustainable contracts that we're working on. So it's that planning, staying in touch with your hop supplier, and you know, working on those contracts where, you know, it benefits all of us. You know, from you, the brewer, the family farms out there.
Yeah, and I think something that, you know, when I look at the graph and sort of that step down model of 3 years, you know, going the other way of growth, right? Like you have 100% of what you think you need right in front of you, or you know, 90 to 100% of it, and then less the next year and less the next year. And I think what I want to call out with that is that, you know, when we think back about the history of hop contracting, right, is up till very recent times, it was like 5+ years out and going the other way, planning for growth, right? And so I think, like you're kind of pointing out, Steve, about some of the timing and like risk and responsibility, like you said, is, you know, by following a cycle like this, it gives you that flexibility to adjust to the unknown, whether it's consumer tastes, whether it's you just decide to kill a beer in your portfolio at the brewery because it just doesn't perform anymore, right? You have left yourself room in the next year, and especially the year after, to adjust your contract without necessarily having to come back to a hop supplier and say, hey, I don't actually need these anymore, right? You've left yourself room to just say, well, I'm going to contract something else because I don't have all my needs covered at this moment. Or if you see something is growing, you've left yourself room to have a better picture because now you're within a year of that and say, okay, I'm going to top up a little more on Citra, right? Because Citra beers are doing really well for me, right? And I just know we're going to grow more. Or maybe you even know at your brewery that you have a plan put together where we're going to launch 3 new IPAs this next year, or we're going to really push on this one brand or something like that, right? You've left yourself room to say, okay, well, I can secure what I need. You're not already 100% planned out and having to work with what you have necessarily. You've left yourself room to make adjustments. And I think what's really stand out with that, and probably very timely and relevant, is actually everything we've gone through this last year, right? With COVID and how it's really impacted everyone's plans and what was going to happen in the brewery. And by following a model like this, where you're stepping down, ideally, you know, you would have left yourself then some room for this harvest we're in right now to say, you know what, now I'm going to be a little long on hops because I wasn't using them all this year like I thought with my crop year 2019. So maybe I don't need to add anything at all. Maybe that 75% now just became 100% of my needs, right? Or you have the room then to say, well, let's actually maybe cut back a little on 20. And, you know, it looks like we could probably get back on the horse again in 2021, so to say, right? Like so you've left yourself that room without necessarily having to come back to any hop supplier and say, now I don't need something that I've already committed to, right? And I think that's where, this model is really important, because I think it sort of sets everyone up to be a lot more successful. And I think it's definitely a learning from the 2015-16 where I think things were very different than what they're pictured here. And I think, from a YCH perspective and communicating with growers all the time too, is there's a lot of advantage in this for us as well, because we know that we can get into a cycle of knowing when brewers are going to be asking for new things, and we still have that projection out, right? So we can still, for growers, they can still say, okay, well, I know that there's future business here, and that, if we all do what we need to do and can supply what we need to do, that this will continue. So it's not necessarily walking away out of contracts, but it's just being a little more conservative with them and setting yourself up to have flexibility in mind. So anyways, it's something we've been talking about actually for almost 2 years now. It's sort of a model that we've adopted and we think is a really successful model for breweries, kind of wherever you are in the world.
Yeah, it definitely gives you that flexibility with your contracts. And, once you get beyond 3 years, it's pretty challenging to really hit your forecast on, what the consumer is going to be doing. So, this model approach that we've been taking, I think there's some brewers becoming fans of it. So, yeah.
Nice. And then, I think a couple things I want to key in on too is, summer is too late for near harvest contracting. And I'll kind of expand on that as we go through here, but you even see some of the dates on there being January for the picture there. But a big part of it is talking to your supplier often, or, for talking to Yakima Chief Hops often. We often have very fluid inventories, right? So even though you may say, oh, I need more of this and it's not available at the time, it doesn't mean that doesn't change on a regular basis. Especially, for us, we're a company that has a global footprint. And so, there may be a brewery here in the US that says, oh, I'm a little long on this. Is there anyone else that would want this, right? And there might be a brewery in France saying, hey, I need more of that same thing, or a brewery in Asia, or a brewery in Brazil, right? Or wherever you might be. And so we're always trying to look at that. And so, even if you reach out and you say, hey, I'm short on this, or I'm long on this, can you help? It's worth having that conversation multiple times. And then also sort of just checking the pulse of the contract, as we'd say, I would look at your contract at least once a quarter. It's not something that you sign once and say, okay, that's all set. The environments are constantly changing. Consumer tastes, Steve, like you said, are constantly changing, right? And so it's something I would check with regularly, and not even just checking with your hop supplier, but also just internally. It's pulling that contract out of a drawer once in a while, or up on your email and looking at it and just saying, hey, does this still make sense? Are we working through these things? And like I mentioned before, if there are certain beers that you're killing in your portfolio or changing, or your production plan has changed, reflecting on, does this still make sense? Is this contract what we need? Because we've maybe made some adjustments here at the brewery. So I think with that, it's, contracts, there is no such thing as set it and forget it. Even if you're planning for growth, it's good to check in often and to top up contracts, like we talked about in that step down model, is that it leaves you that room to top up all the time. Okay, we're growing, we're only at 75% of our needs, and I think we're going to grow even beyond that. So now I have some room to add some things to it, right? And it's a good tie into that. It's not set it and forget it. So it's checking on it regularly. Like we would recommend definitely quarterly, reflecting at least internally, and also reaching out and just saying, hey, I think this may need to change, because the sooner we can have those conversations, the better. And then really, if you have too many hops, or maybe you find yourself long in a certain variety, it's just check in often to explore those options. Like I said, our inventories are very fluid, and although right now maybe we don't have a need, or know someone who has a need for that, it doesn't mean that won't change maybe within a week or a month, right? And that maybe we see that, because we're always, for us, the ideal scenario is that all the hops find a home in beer somewhere, right? And so we're constantly working and are absolutely willing to help make that happen for everyone as well. Because, it doesn't actually benefit Yakima Chief hops at all if someone is long on something and can't find a home in beer, and then later has to sell them or do something else with them. We would much rather have gotten that to someone who was looking for those things. So I think when I think of some of those dates too, and I kind of alluded to this, but I think some really, really important dates to think about when you're thinking about contracting are sort of these 4 big milestones that really have an effect on it. And the first one is September. It's where we are now. It's what we're in the middle of, is hop harvest here. And what that really marks for us is our positions that we sell throughout the year change from being a projection to what we think we're going to get based on acreage and yields and what growers and regions. And, basically we have a number of how many hops of this variety do we think we're going to get based on what we know is out there and who's growing them. And based on averages to kind of account for weather and changes and things like that. But this is the month where as everything comes in and gets accounted for, we go from what we think we're going to get to what we actually have, right? And that can actually be a huge shift sometimes for us, is that maybe yields are really up on a certain variety or they're really down, right? And so like I said about checking in often, this is that opportunity to say, hey, at end of September, early October, I know you said maybe that this isn't available right now, but is it now? And that's a really good conversation to have, because it's something that changes for us very, very rapidly. And really too, I think something to note, especially via YCH, is, when we get into that late summer, end of July, end of August sort of timeframe, we often are a little more conservative about what we're selling, because we're also, knowing that hops are an agricultural product, they're susceptible to the vagaries of Mother Nature, right? And so you can have really low yields, you can have wind damage, right? You can have all these things. And so we often do sort of plan on some buffer there, right? Or something we would call a buffer or a safe kind of safety net to make sure that we don't overcommit and actually have a negative impact on contracts that already exist. So it's important to think of September as a month where we get a much clearer picture of what we actually have. And so something that maybe wasn't available can become available, right? And so just because something wasn't available once doesn't mean that won't change. So this month is a big month where a lot of that kind of thing can happen. And then in November, this is really, I think, important to know, and maybe breweries aren't always aware of, is that planning for next harvest already begins. So, right, this coming November, we're already going to be talking in depth about 2021 and what that needs to look like. And so YCH and YCR, Yakima Chief Hops and Yakima Chief Ranches, begin assessing needs and adjustments for next harvest. And also the availability of our current crop year begins, right? So although we're already processing and some things are available now, really November is when you start seeing most things on your contract become available. So, we'll see that here in a really short amount of time, where a lot of 2020 is going to be available, pelleted, cryo, things like that. And then really January, and this is probably the most important date on here from asking for adjustments on contract, is this is the month where we communicate to growers our recommendations on acreage changes, right? So we've started talking about November. A lot of conversations happen with growers throughout the fall and winter. But end of January, usually targeted around the Hop Growers Convention, which falls at the end of that month, we will go to growers and say, here's what you grow that we're asking you to grow for YCH, and we're going to recommend swapping certain acreages, and we're going to recommend you have room to expand on this variety, right? And really from there, from January on to the next harvest, we start working with a very finite resource, right? So up until this point, we have, when we're contracting years up into the future, we have the ability to make some plans on how we're going to get there and what acreage expansion or changes might need to happen. But once we communicate in January to growers, hey, this is what we're asking you to do, they're going to start taking action. And ultimately that becomes a set quantity that's going to occur for the year. And like Steve said early on, we get one shot a year to get it right. So this is actually one of the most critical times of year for hop growers, because they're going to be out planting, swapping fields, expanding into new acreage. And once that happens, it's set, it's in the ground. And what we get from here is it's going to be through the growing season. And so when you think between January and August, we're slowly chipping away at that projection again of what we think we're going to get. And so, when we get big surprise asks maybe of certain varieties that we weren't aware of, or no contracts indicated an interest, but suddenly someone said, oh, actually I need this. That's where we have some challenges sometimes, because we already know there's only going to be a certain amount come September again. So really, it's hard to do, I know, but really looking at the year ahead in December and January and really thinking about what your needs are and communicating in January gives you the most flexibility in that conversation, because it gives us the most flexibility of being able to plan for your needs. And then the last really important date is that August 31st, right? It's the for US brewers, right? It's that end of contract. Really, that's the big push of hops needing to for the last crop year cycle and for the brewing year. Needing to get out the door so that we have space for an entire year's worth of the next year's harvest to come in the door and be processed. So just some important milestones, and why we look at that January 31st is almost a deadline of being able to make a lot of changes, because it's not that we can't after the fact, but it just becomes a lot harder to, because like I said, it's a finite resource we're working with.
Hey, Brian.
Yeah.
We have a question that kind of relates to that.
Oh,
Is
great.
May too late to contract for upcoming harvest? Would tying up a contract in April, May be ideal?
No, that's a good question. And like I said, it's never too late. I think you can always have those conversations, and we engage in what we call continuous contracting, right? So if it's available, we will work towards contracting it. Like I said, we were always trying to target, making sure that all hops that growers are growing end up in a beer somewhere. So it's not that we stop contracting at all, but it's just knowing that the later you get into the year, so May, is that other people have been contracting and there's not room anymore for us to add new acreage, right? Or add more of a variety in the world. So if we're short on something or something is completely sold out necessarily in May, we may not really know again if it's available until after harvest. And if it's still not, then it's going to be planned for in that next harvest cycle. So May is definitely not too late, but it's not necessarily ideal, especially if you're chasing varieties that are really, really high demand, things like Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe, where there's a lot of other people trying to contract those as well. So I would keep that in mind, is the sooner the better, really, because that's where there's as much flexibility as Yakima Chief hops and growers have to adjust to meet your needs instead of just saying, well, here's what I have.
Yeah, definitely the sooner the better. And there are, as Brian mentioned, some varieties that we will pause on maybe after midsummer, just until after harvest to see what kind of yield we have. And then we'll revisit those pounds, and then we'll make a decision from that point. As, if we continue contracting or make it available for spot.
Yeah, excellent question. And then I think the last thing really we have on here, or is kind of tying this back to what we talked about earlier with return to grower, is so return to grower for us actually works in that we receive hops and we actually pay growers throughout the year for those hops based on how they sell in the market and how they perform in the market. So what you see on the screen here, these are actually the 4 months that we make payments to growers. And why this is so important to note and think about also the dates we just talked about in that cycle is that until YCH fully pays the last payment in December, is growers are actually still part owners in the hops that we procure, right? So what this really translates, I think, to breweries is that when you're contracting with Yakima Chief hops, you're not just contracting with a hop supplier, you're contracting with family farms, right? Yakima Chief hops, we're an extension of farms. And so although we may do the contracting, we may write them and tell you what's available and what's not, at the end of the day, we're representing farms and we're here on behalf of farms who are also owning some of these hops. And so this has some immediate and large impacts when you think about contracting on growers and their family farms, is that if you're long on something or you're short on something, that has an immediate and direct impact back to those growers. And so it's just something I think is really important to keep in mind is I would really recommend, that, like we talked about with 2020, is that contracting is still very relevant. And part of it is because, this awesome community we have in beer is that hop growers and their families are part of it, right? And so I would say it's not even just contracting for your needs, but it's contracting on your values as well. And yes, I want to support and work with these people just as much as they're really excited to see the success of your brewery. And to know that you're excited about new flavors and aromas of new hops that they're growing and part of the breeding program, and just, even just the quality of hops that might come from different farms and different attributes you might get from their terroir or their picking windows and things like that. So I think it's really important to note, and I think why it's something else to talk about on here that I really want to drive home is that this is something that's really, really unique to Yakima Chief. Yakima Chief hops is that this model, we're not in a buy-sell model. So we're not just saying, thank you for your hops, here's a check, and then we're going to sell these. We're working with growers to sell hops throughout the year. And I think that's a huge value, should always be considered when contracting. So. All right, there you go.
Cool. It's like we're getting to the end of the presentation. So yeah, some key takeaways. I'm sure everyone caught when that we mentioned contracting a couple times. Again, the contracts are very important to all of us. It really provides that balance. If spot is available, and it fills your voids, yeah, go ahead, take advantage of the spot, again, when it's available. But by all means, that does not replace not having a contract. Contracts are very important to the industry as a whole. And, we'll continue to listen and help where we can with, having nice, sustainable contracts for our customers. And, without those contracts, we don't have our growers. We don't have our family farms. I mean, in the USA today, there's less than 100 growers. So that's another major takeaway there on contracting. And it is a living organism. I mean, it's fluid. It's constantly moving. Just like what you have on a daily basis at your brewery. Just like the pumps, just like forklifts, just like centrifuges. I mean, it takes a lot of regular maintenance to keep everything running properly the way it should be. And it's sustainability. It's a pretty important word in the hop industry, and at least for us at Yakima Chief Hops.
Yeah, I think some of my big takeaways, Steve, I think you hit it all right there. But is when I think especially this year with everything that the brewing industry has gone through, with the impacts of COVID on a lot of small breweries, especially, is just that, like it says here, contracts underpin the market. And so if we see, even though there's a lot of uncertainty, if we continue to see a trend away, it's actually going to just mean a more volatile market for a lot of breweries, which is just not a benefit to them, and it's detrimental to growers as well. And so my big takeaway really is just that 2020, although there is a lot of unknowns, and especially entering into 2021 next year, but it really is a time to look at and try to send those signals to the hop industry of what you need more than ever, because just as much as unknown in the consumer side and at breweries, there's a lot of unknown in the hop industry as well too. If we see a lot of change or walk away from contracts, that's going to get us back, I think, into a lot of places that we've been in the past, where you see a little more of that boom bust cycle. And like I said, I think my message in that is definitely not a one to be concerned with or to say that the sky's falling in any way, but I think it's something we should all be very aware of. And that's where I'm excited to, I think, talk through this today is just this is what we're seeing, and wanting to share that with the industry. And I think, some of the dates and things that we mentioned in here as well. If anyone hasn't had a chance, this morning, some of our European team actually did an awesome job covering the same topic and brought it a lot more in line with sort of the dates and times that maybe apply to other brewers outside the US. I realize a lot of the things we're talking about are very, North America, US focused. So if you want to learn more, that's a great thing to check out. But yeah, otherwise, and then I saw, Nicole, you also put in the chat, the Brewing Network podcast. And so I don't see any questions unless I'm wrong. But I think something that I wanted to highlight is that if you want to learn more too about this, we talked a lot about this as a hop supplier, right? And the impacts of growers and what it means for the hop industry. But I know I've definitely been asked, right, from brewers is, well, how do I plan and what my actual needs are? It's great. I understand why I need to contract, but how do I start contracting? You're thinking about contracting. Maybe you're a new brewery. You're not quite sure where your portfolio is going to go yet when it comes to your beer lineup. Or maybe you have a really unique portfolio where you don't have a flagship, right? And you're planning on just doing something new all the time. So where do you begin? And so I think one in the chat there, Nicole actually posted a really awesome podcast that Nick Ziegler, part of our technical team here, did with Brewing Network that actually talks a lot about that and draws on a lot of his experience of being a brewer and working at Magic Rock in the UK. But also I would say just some thoughts on that from my perspective is, I would start by looking at what is your hopping rates, right? What are you, for certain recipes, especially ones that you're going to be making quite often, maybe they're your go-tos, maybe they're your flagships. I'm just saying how many pounds per barrel, right? Or how many grams per hectoliter am I using? And then start thinking about over the course of the year, how many times am I going to make this, right? And this, you start building a picture, and it doesn't have to be 100%, right? But you start building a picture of, okay, well, if I make this recipe 25 times, and it uses, 2 pounds per barrel, and my system is this big, you start getting an idea of like, okay, if I put all that together, I now know, okay, I need 500 pounds of this or 10,000 pounds of this, right? And it starts giving you an idea of to make that minimum, right? And then that's where I think you need to just understand too, what's my comfort level with my plan? If we're going to do new stuff all the time, Maybe I don't want to plan on 100% of that, and I am going to rely a little bit on spot, because maybe we end up not making it 25 times. Maybe we end up making it 20 times, right? Or maybe if you're a much larger, like production focused brewery, and you know, okay, this is our flagship and this is exactly how many barrels we're going to make this year, then that gives you a pretty clear picture of exactly how many hops you need. And then I would just say, like, you know, like Steve recommended on that 100%, 75, 50 kind of step down is there any sort of wiggle room I need to leave myself, right? Is there, even at 100%, like I mentioned, maybe it's 90 to 100%, because you're not quite sure, or maybe you see one of the beers that you're really planning on struggling or not growing in your portfolio, and you're a little concerned about getting a little long on certain varieties. Something to consider. And then I also think with that comes the tie into just communicating with your hop suppliers on a regular basis is the sooner the better. I know we mentioned this earlier, but I think this ties into how do you build your plan is, let's say you now have your new brewery, and then maybe now you've been brewing for 5 years, right? Or 10 years. And you might see a brand that really relied on a Cascade and Chinook become less popular in your portfolio. And you've decided now, you know what, I'm going to cut that out of the portfolio. I think we have other things now that are going to plug in there and become interesting to my consumers again. Well, I think those are those conversations that always be thinking about, or when you're looking at your hop contracts on that quarterly cycle, communicating that to suppliers as well, because it's a lot easier for us as a company to say, oh, you're going to kill this brand. Well, then let's work with you on getting out of this variety. Maybe that variety was only used in that one beer that you're now killing. So if you don't have that in your portfolio anymore, the sooner you can tell a hop supplier that, the better. Worst case scenario would be you do that, you go a year without using it, and then at the end of your contract, you come back and say, oh, you know what, I killed that beer last February. We actually don't need any of these. Well, that's a really hard place to be in, right, for a hop supplier and for growers, because we have the next harvest coming in, or maybe it already has come in, and now you're looking to return back something it's a little older. People are excited about the new crop year, right? So there's all those challenges. So the answer early on, maybe, yeah, no problem, let's make some adjustments, where later it might be, we're really not sure if we can find another home for this for you, right? So I think consider that too, in that timing and planning is, where are certain brands in your portfolio going to go of beer, right? Are you planning on growing some of these? Are you planning on shrinking them? Are there some that you might actually be thinking about taking out altogether? So. But all right, awesome. Nicole, I guess if there's not any questions, I don't think I have any other thoughts. I think we've probably said quite a bit about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was great. I just want to thank you guys so much for your time. Lots of great, valuable information. And like Brian said, we have a European version, specific to that area, up on the Virtual Harvest website as well, and on Whova. So like I said, reminder, this was recorded, and hopefully in the next hour and a half, the recording will be updated on the website, so you can watch that for those that missed this live. And for questions, feel free to email brewschool@yakimachief.com for general ones. Even contracting questions, we can forward you to the right salesperson depending on your region. And then if you do have some brewing questions, feel free to email brewinghelp@yakimachief.com. Other than that, that's all we got. And so hope you all have a great rest of your day, and see you on the next session.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Good one.